Hi, I'm Krista Fleckenstein. I'm an artist, author, and maker, and I like to use mixed media applique in my modern quilts. Today I'm going to show you some techniques that you can use in yours. I like to use a lot of different materials when I do quilting, and something I've been playing around with a lot lately is using leather in my quilts. So today I'm going to show you how to use a die cutter machine, which is my preferred method because cutting out leather can be a little tricky at times. When you're using a die cutting machine, you first have to use the materials and make a sandwich to go into the machine. On the bottom first, we have our plastic cutting pad. On the top, I've chosen this Drunkard's Path die cut. You can see that the blades are facing the top. They're under this foam layer here. So when you set it down, you can see that the design is right on the top. When I'm using leather, it's a little bit thicker, so I'm only going to use one layer, but one of the great things about die cut machines is that you can layer thinner things like quilting cotton and cut multiple layers at once. But today I'm just going to use the one piece of leather. So we set the leather on top and center it on. And then on top of that, we'll place another cutting pad to complete our sandwich. Once we have our sandwich together, we're going to carry it to the machine and load it in. It can be a little tricky to keep the layers together, but once you get to the machine, if anything slips, you can load it back in just fine. So you're going to set the sandwich on top into the machine, and you're going to turn the crank and feed that sandwich in. You're going to feel a little bit of resistance as it goes through, and then it's going to start cutting. One nice thing too is this won't stretch the leather. It'll keep the shape of the leather really nice as it goes through. So once it's all the way through, just pull out the sandwich. And you can see that it created these really beautiful die cuts out of the leather right here. Sometimes if a little corner gets caught, just give it a little snip. Now that we have our die cuts, I'm going to show you how we can put them onto our fabric to keep them stable. One of the challenges with leather is it can be really stretchy. This is a deerskin leather. I like to use leather that is light in weight. You want it to be under 3 ounces. It might sound kind of confusing, but you can ask at a leather store what the weights are. This is nice and thin. It's also flexible, but it does stretch. So when I'm sewing it, I want to make sure that it's stabilized a little bit so that it doesn't distort on my fabric. And I like to use fusible web for that. So I also cut my fusible web using the die cutter, but I do like to actually cut my fusible web a little bit smaller than my applique piece so that the fusible web doesn't poke out around the edges. So you can see I just trimmed it up just a slight bit. And now I'm going to take it to the iron and press it on. So I'm going to place the fusible web onto the back side of my leather. I'm going to use a dry iron, a nice hot iron, and it really just takes a few seconds to fuse it onto the back of the leather. You let that paper cool and peel it off. And what that fusible will do is it will actually stabilize the leather and keep it from stretching, and it becomes a lot more stable too once you press it onto the back of the fabric. So here I have my pre-cut square. I'm going to place the block onto the corner. I keep the leather within the seam allowances so that I am including it into the quilt. That way I only need to stitch the curved edge. When I get to my pressing board, I'm going to kind of eyeball it, but then I am going to iron it from the back side of the fabric instead of ironing the leather directly itself. When you're using an iron with leather, you do want to make sure you're not touching it to the front surface. It can actually create a mark that doesn't go away. So you always press on the back side. I'm just going to give that a press for a few seconds. And now we've got our block ready to sew. Now when I'm sewing leather on my sewing machine, there are a couple of different things than I would use than if I was using just quilting cotton. The first, I put in a leather needle. The leather needle is a bit sharper and creates a cleaner hole for the leather. It pierces through a little bit more easily. Very easy to find. I also use a non-stick foot, or you can also use a walking foot. That creates less drag on the leather and makes it so that it does not stretch as you sew. I also use a polyester thread. That's really important. If you use a cotton thread when you're sewing with leather, over time the oils from the leather will actually degrade the cotton and your piece will fall apart. So always use polyester thread. Now when I'm doing my top stitching for this, I'm going to follow along the curve. It's a nice gentle curve, so it's not tricky to do. And I like to stay about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. The other thing to do is also to make sure that your stitch length is longer for leather. Leather can tear, so I move it up to about a 3.5 to 4 level stitch length. And there we have it. So I have a couple of blocks already prepared, and now I'm going to sew them together. Now when you're working with leather, you don't want to use pins, and you also want to prevent the leather from stretching and distorting in your blocks. So I like to use these clips. Line up your two pieces, or the two blocks together, and secure them with clips. Sometimes it can be easier to actually put the fabric on top instead of putting the leather on the top. You can use the Teflon foot when you're sewing together the cotton. That works just fine. You don't need to switch it out, but I am going to decrease my stitch length a bit. And when I get to the leather, I'm actually going to increase it back up, a little over a 3. And there we have some blocks. You can see that I used it to create the quilt in the back. It's a really fun way to use leather when you mix it with denim and other fabrics. Creates a nice rustic feel. Another material that I like to use when I'm doing mixed media applique is felt. And this time I'm actually going to be using a triangle block. Again, set it with the cutting pad on the bottom. Your die on top of that, face up. A layer of felt, again, I prefer to use just one layer at a time because it is a little bit thicker. And again, we're going to feed the sandwich in. And put it through the die cutter. And it is like magic. So with felt, I'll also use fusible web for the backing. And actually, when I'm doing felt, or even with leather, you can use it on top of already quilted items. You don't have to use it in piecing. So on the quilt in the back there, I've used it to add some extra visual interest to a quilt that I've done by fusing it onto the top, and again, just top stitching around all 3 sides since the edge is not caught into the seam. So just to recap, when you're working with leather, you want to make sure that your leather is lightweight. You want to have it under 3 ounces. Remember that leather stretches. You'll want to stabilize it with a fusible web. When you're sewing on your machine, just pick up a leather needle. You want to use a non-stick foot or a walking foot to keep it from stretching while you sew. And don't forget about the polyester thread as well. So next time, consider using different materials like leather when you're making your quilts.